Welcome back, everyone. This conversation on organizational, cultural, as well as organization information theory, they dovetail off of the back of structuration theory, which was our last discussion. So make sure you check that out, and then this is going to feed into the next exam, which is on Friday. All right. So a lot of this stuff is going to look familiar with regard to structuration theory. So we'll be able to go through it a little bit quicker. But again, just make sure you go back and check out structuration theory. Just so you can sort of put the pieces together. All right. So organizational culture theory. What this says is that people are like spiders who are suspended in webs as that they created at work. An organization's culture is composed of shared symbols, each of which has a unique meaning. Organizational stories, rituals, values, and rites of passages are examples of the culture of an organization. Boil this all down, what we're saying is that organizations have norms. All right. We have ways that we are supposed to act and operate within a culture. Not only does it help the culture have cohesion, right, but it also separates that work environment culture or that family's culture or that sports team's culture. It defines it as separate from other groups that are like it on the outside, right? So it creates this in-group mentality, and as you participate in similar language and behaviors and rituals as other people, that creates cohesion. All right. Um, and that separates you and your group, that lets you know that you are a group and that people in different groups are in out groups. All right. So this idea of creating cohesion or cultural norms, it's not just about sort of perpetuating the norms so that the organization can be isolated, right? But it's also about these communication strategies that let people know that you are part of the tribe, right? So it is this way of creating in groups and out groups. We act according to scripts, which is stuff that also plays off Kenneth Burke, which we go over in rhetorical theory. And it's much like theater, which we've talked about the Shakespeare quote, "All life is a stage," right? The men and women, the actors, we're just sort of playing a role, right? So that's the mentality. Is this is very performative in the fact that we go out in the world and we have to figure out how do I perform in this situation. Well, what does my script say? All right. So we do have these individual performances. So how you act normally, how you expect people to act based on personality, age, gender, nationality, etc. All right. So if we just take sort of gender norms, for instance, right? And again, these are gender norms with regard to uh, generalizable stereotypes. So again, it's not true for all people. Um, but if someone was to ask you in a stereotypical fashion, how do men act? How do women act? You'd be able to give stereotypical answers that are recognizable to lots of people. Now, you can say whether or not these gender norms are problematic or whether or not you wish they would change, etc., right? But we all have a baseline for understanding what these stereotypical representations are at their base level, all right? Same is true with regard to age or occupation. So, for instance, how do college students act? And again, we come to this place where we walk into a room. We're the new person in that room. You're a freshman in college. You're not exactly sure how you're supposed to behave. The best way to sort of get along in college is very performative, where you start to act, right? Much like theater, you are acting like the people around you are acting, right? You figure out how a college classroom works, how to be a college student by performing a college student until it becomes normal for you to behave that way. You could say the same is true for gender stereotypes. You say, well, you see little kids, sort of playing out these roles. Um, little boys will take their dad's razor, they'll take the blade out, and they'll act like they're shaving, even though they don't have whiskers, right? Little girls go into their mom's makeup kits and they start putting on makeup, right? Little kids start to act out in a very theatrical way what it's like to be an adult with regard to gender norms or stereotypical norms, right? Now, again, not everybody does that. There are plenty of kids who cross gender norms, right? So little boys who play with their mom's makeup, there are little girls who play with, army men and dump trucks, right? All these sorts of things happen, right? But again, little kids are sort of trying to perform these adult characteristics of gender with regard to figuring out what it is to be in a specific, sexed body, right? But then again, like as you continue to perform these acts become normalized to you, where you are no longer performing them anymore as this sort of fake way of trying to get through life, but they're actually just become a part of you, right? So at some point in college, you're no longer looking around the room thinking, how am I supposed to act as a college student? But you've just sort of completely embodied it, and now it has become habit forming. The same thing is true with things like masculinity and femininity. You perform it so often that it becomes normalized, and all of a sudden you are acting either more masculine or more feminine. And it's not a performance anymore as it was when maybe you were 7 years old going through your parents' stuff. All right. So these are how cultural norms are created, and then they are later perpetuated through the enactment of constant performance. Within an organization, you have ritual performances. So these are the regular behaviors within an organization. And you also have personal rituals, which is how you act within an organization. All right. So ritual performance, this could be sort of common things that happen around the office. So if we think about a business setting, right? So what are some certain rituals that happen at the office? Do you have, I don't know, weird little things like casual Friday? Do you have different holiday parties? Maybe there are certain months of the year that are important to your organization, so you have various parties. So for instance, at Penn State, for faculty members, right after graduation's over in May, like the second week of May is kind of important. There's usually some sort of like end of the year faculty get together that is a ritual performance that happens in mid-May, right? For a company, maybe it's the end of June or the first week of July because that's the end of the fiscal year, right? There might be some sort of like ritual performance where there's some sort of celebratory party. Anytime your company has a specific start date or an end date to some sort of uh, uh, financial success, product launch, if there's some sort of ritual that commonly happens around that, around these um, like markers, that could be considered some sort of ritual performance for that specific organization. If you think about it with regard to family structures, for instance, the sort of constant, holidays that happen within families, depending on the culture that you're from, these would be ritual performances where it's just sort of expected that in the third Thursday of November, it's like you're going to be home for Thanksgiving, right? You're going to be home for Christmas. You're going to be home for Easter. You're going to be like there are certain days that are just sort of expected that you are going to be home and partaking in the norms of the organization. Now, the personal rituals is who you are within that specific organization. Um, we've talked about how your personality can be different organization to organization or group to group with regard to the multiple groups you find yourself in. So at work, you might be the very quiet and shy person, but when you're with your family, maybe you're the very outspoken, loud, sort of clown of the family. All right. So your personal rituals are who you are within the various organizations or how it is you're supposed to act and behave with regard to the overall rituals that are happening. So let's say Christmas happens. Let's say that you're the person at Christmas who everybody just goes to and says, you and your brother are the two people who are going to be handing out presents. And it's just sort of you fall into line every year as you're the first ones who go to underneath the tree to start handing out the presents, right? At Thanksgiving, it's just sort of known that dad is going to carve the turkey, right? So that's his personal ritual to the larger ritual performance of the family, all right? And you find yourself in these various, you find yourself having these various personal responsibilities in various organizations that it's just sort of known you're the person within the organization that completes that specific task within the larger ritual, all right? So if it's at work, maybe you're just a really good public speaker at work and they always ask you to give opening comments to the new fiscal year or the launching of a new product at work, and they say, look, you've just done this a few times. We understand that you're really good at this. Like, can you just continue to do it? there's nothing in your job description that says that you're the one who has to give this speech every year, but it's just sort of become your personal responsibility because that's who you are within the organization. All right. The main activity of organizations is the process of making sense of equivocal and ambiguous information. So what this means is that an organization can be very large, say 1,000 people who work for a company. And one of the things that is of interest to people who do business communication, right, is how do we get the same message to all 1,000 people within the company in order to make the company run smoothly, right? We need to get them very specific, detailed information so that they all interpret that information the same way, so that they all perform in the same way, so that there is no miscommunication, right? There's a lot of problems with miscommunication in corporations when it comes to achieving goals, and all of a sudden you have somebody who's working on the 30th floor and somebody's working on the 10th floor. They're trying to achieve the same goal, but they're going at it different ways because they've interpreted the same memo differently. All right. So there's very ambiguous information. It's like, how do we succinct that to make it as clear as possible so that people are working towards similar goals in the same manner, right? Organizational members accomplish this sense-making process. That's an important word, sense-making process, through enactment, selection, retention of information. We'll go over that on the next slide. Organizations are successful to the extent that they are able to reduce evocality through these means. All right. So equivocality, this idea of ambiguousness, this idea of confusion, right? You have to be able to reduce confusion within a company so that everyone can get on the same page. All right. We'll go over more of this on the next slide, right? One thing you do need to know for the exam is this idea of the theory of socio-culture evolution. So hopefully you know what evolution is in the biological sense, right? Charles Darwin, small changes in order to better adapt to the world around you, all right? Socio-culture evolution is being able to make small behavioral changes in your life in order to adapt to the changing world around you, right? Evolution is biology. My biology, not my personal biology, but the biology of my species makes small little changes over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of years in order to better adapt to the world around us. Socioculture is I have to change my behaviors constantly in order to adapt to a changing world, right? So for instance, you can think about all the ways in which computer technology has changed the world of business, right? So a company that is just a brick and mortar store can't survive. So socioculture evolution of that business is going to have to be online sales, using credit cards, using PayPal, Venmo, Squarespace, right? Possibly Bitcoin, right? These different cryptocurrencies, etc. A business has to be able to adapt to the changing business world around it. Otherwise, it's going to go out of business. All right. There's this really interesting documentary I just saw on Netflix called The Last Blockbuster that talks about sort of the demise of Blockbuster. And they don't. One of the people who worked for Blockbusters in the movie, they don't say that Netflix caused the demise of Blockbuster, but they do talk about the ways in which Blockbuster failed to quickly adapt to sort of like the online world of movies and streaming, etc. So you no longer go to a video store. All right, so Blockbuster was in the business of distributing movies. They didn't adapt quickly enough to the evolving culture around them with online streaming, and therefore they sort of fell out, right? And there's only one Blockbuster store left in the world, and it's in Bend, Oregon. So this whole movie is about this last Blockbuster store, right? So socioculture evolution is about how do businesses have to adapt their behavior in order to keep up with the changing world so that they can continue to meet the demands of people in the ways in which people are seeking those demands. People still want to watch movies, right? So the demands haven't changed, but the ways in which they want to watch movies has changed. All right, so you probably heard this with regard to the biological theory of evolution, right? Survival of the fittest. This is usually misinterpreted, all right? when people hear the idea survival of the fittest, they usually think, species get bigger and stronger in order to fight off other species. That's not what it means. All right, it can mean that. That's not what it means. When people say survival of the fittest, what they mean is the species that is most able to adapt to its surroundings, right? So it is best fitted for the environment that it's in. So this could mean that the species actually gets smaller and weaker in order to get into smaller holes, right? Burrow into the ground in order to, go after, bugs and other, other food sources that are in the ground, right? So fittest means adapted to the environment. Which species is best fitted to the world that it's in. All right, it doesn't mean bigger, stronger, can kill everything around it. It means best fitted for the world that it currently inhabits. All right, so your business needs to be fitted to the world that it's in. Right, if not, it's going to die out. We see some of this stuff, some of the pushback. Let's think of like taxi cab companies. So with like Uber and Lyft coming on the scenes, taxi cab companies are dragging their feet, and they're not, ramping up sort of like and recognizing the changing world around them quickly enough, and they're starting to die out, and there's competition, and they're really worried about their future. Newspapers, journalists, journalism is fighting with this right now, right? The ways in which we receive our news is drastically changing, and journalism just isn't changing quickly enough. And all of a sudden, there's these huge, massive layoffs at all these various media outlets. And so you just have to you have to be aware of how does our company need to evolve in order to adapt to the changing world, right? So socioculture, evolution. I need to change my behaviors because the culture around me is changing. They still want the same stuff. People still want the news. People still need a ride from point A to point B, right? I just need to change. People still want to buy stuff, right? I might need to change my behavior, the way that I interact with the world around me. Because if I don't evolve, I'm going to go out of business. And that gets us to this next slide, right? Adapting to get the best information, right? Knowledge is power, okay? So there's various ways to go about, making sure that your company has the best information. And part of that best information is how are possible consumers going to react to the changing business model? All right. Again, cultures, they must adapt. All right. So enactment, sense making, selection, and retention. So let's look at this quickly with regard to dispersing information. So first is enactment. So how will this information be received and interpreted by the larger culture? All right. So this is a process question. So I just updated this example because it's in the news a lot. So there's a situation down at the U.S.-Mexican border with regard to the amount of migrants who are coming over, and coming over without going through the proper channels, right? Because when people come over and they have their paperwork all in order, it's like you can come on and you can do your thing. But people are showing up to the border without their paperwork in order, who have not gone through proper channels, and so now they're in the United States, and then there's all these systems involved, right? So there's ways in which the current White House administration, right, is sort of looking at, how this information is going to be received and interpreted. And so there's ways in which the White House sends out memos to everybody in the White House with regard to how do we describe the situation at the border. So do we say it's a border crisis? And you're like, ooh, it's a crisis. That sounds bad. Or do we say it's a challenge? And a challenge is like, oh, that's something that, that's almost sounds empowering in some regard. Like someone puts a challenge in front of me. I'm like, ooh, I'm going to solve this problem. All right. Do we say it's a situation at the border, which sounds very soft and not that big of a deal? All right. So there's all, this happens in the White House all the time. Every administration does it. They're called talking points, right? But they get everybody in the White House, whatever the administration is, and they get them on board with like, here are 5 key terms, words, vocabularies that you're going to repeat because we want to make sure that the proper vocabulary words, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page with regard to how we are describing this situation, right? So you might not want to call it a crisis. So you're going to get people on the news, and some news anchor is going to say like, Secretary, Homeland Secretary, Defense Secretary, whoever, right? is this a crisis on the border? And they're going to say, oh, it's not a crisis. It's a challenge. We're working on it. It's a situation. We have it under control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Um, there's going to be other people who don't like the administration. They're going to be like, it's a crisis at the border. So I would imagine right now, like Republican senators and stuff, they would go down there and say, this is a crisis, right? Because they have a different messaging strategy when it comes to combating the White House on immigration policy. All right. So when you're in an organization, one of the key things with regard to getting information out there and getting everyone on the same page is getting everybody on the same page by carefully choosing the words you're going to use to describe the situation. All right. I had another example, but the other example, I think it was just released, a leaked memo a couple days ago, is that the White House is no longer going to refer, well, when it comes to media publicity, they are no longer going to refer to the White House as the Biden administration, but they are now telling everybody in the White House to refer to it as the Biden-Harris administration. And that's interesting, right? It's never been done before. We didn't call it the Trump-Pence administration. We just called it the Trump administration, or the Obama administration, or the Bush administration. So the Biden administration is now attaching the vice president's name to the administration, and there's, people look at that and they say, okay, there's something that, the administration wants the rest of us outside to know or to relate to. We don't necessarily know what it is or what it's about, but telling all their people to now refer to it as the Biden-Harris administration, is the way in which they're trying to disseminate information with regard to how that information is being received and how it's being interpreted. All right, sense making. Once we have info, how do we understand it, which is the process question, right? So are there agreed upon ways of prioritizing? All right, so narrative sense making is important for various organizations. And what narrative sense making does is we all need to understand the situation in a similar fashion. So again, if you have a company of 1,000 people and you send out one memo to 1,000 people, there are multiple ways that memo might be understood. And if it is understood differently by various people in the company, then you're going to get various results, and there's going to be a lot of miscommunication and mismanagement. So the sense-making part is making sure that everybody is understanding the information in the same way. So how can I present information in a way to get everybody to assimilate into the culture that we're asking them to assimilate into? All right. Sense-making. How do we make sense of the world? All right. Selection. The best way of obtaining information. All right. So what information will we seek and obtain? Then we have to go out and get it. So with selection, you ask yourself a question within an organization. Everybody needs to get specific information. Do you send it out in an email? Do you call together a committee meeting? Do you put together some sort of large company forum where everybody's going to show up in a big auditorium and you're going to lecture them for an hour? Do you send out a video post, right? So selection is, how do we get this information to people in a way in which they are going to read it? So if you think about, maybe you now, because we've moved to Zoom, but once you get into sort of the business world, you're going to realize that you are going to get so many emails every day, and so many of those emails are just going to be noise, and you're just going to start deleting them. You're not even going to read through all of them. It's too much information to read. Companies are aware of this, right? So companies have to figure out interesting and creative ways to make sure that you are getting the information that you need, and that you are selecting and actually reading through and taking to heart the information that is coming across your desk. All right. So we know what we want everyone to say. We all have a shared story about that. Now, how are we going to sort of propagate that in a way that people take it in and they actually read it? All right. That's the selection process. And finally, retention. All right, is just what it sounds like. Retention is, are people going to be able to take these stories that we've told them and hold on to them and like continually enact them in their day-to-day life, sort of at this company, at this organization. So retention is a couple of things, right? So first, collective memory and shared narratives, even if they're false ones, right? Which is extremely important for lots of other reasons, right? Um, in rhetorical theory, which is a class I teach in the fall, we talk about ideas of fantasy themes and myths that hold organizations or cultures together, right? So if your culture has a shared myth, right? So let's say, the Christmas story, right? It's a shared collective memory that has been retained, and it sort of holds everybody together within your culture, during the month of December, right? The 4th of July is some sort of shared story that holds everybody together in the middle of the summer, right? If you're a part of a certain like sports, your favorite sports team, right? There's various sports teams that have these very interesting sort of like legendary stories about mythical characters, important athletes, right? It's a collective memory that kind of holds everybody together who is a fan of that specific team, all right? So that's the retention of like, do you remember back in like 1973 when so and so, ran a ball or shot a basket, or it's like everybody who knows that sports teams kind of remembers that story from the 1970s, and it kind of holds everybody together. Yeah, it's a retained important marker of a story within the larger organization. All right. You retain what will be useful to the organization moving forward, and then you are retaining the organization's history. All right. So this is what sort of makes up a culture an organizational culture, right? With regard to how the organization disseminates information, and how they hold on to information in order to make decisions and in order to have a cohesive culture. All right. So know these items. They'll be on the exam. The next class we have is an exam time. But between this video as well as structuration theory video, that's going to cover a lot of stuff with regard to organizational communication, and how organizations work to create a shared sense of culture and a shared sense of community. You have to speak a common language. Part of speaking that common language is by having shared stories, shared experiences, shared rituals, and everybody needs to come together and sort of know their role in enacting these various information strategies, or enacting these various rituals that we all participate in throughout the various organizations that we find ourselves in throughout our life. All right, that's all I got. I will see you next time.